Today we come to the episode to Timothy. We'll start with First Timothy. The previous book was Thessalonians, where we saw how Christians should work, not be idle, because God works. We have a working God. It's all keeping every day, keeping things going. In his Son, we saw him moving, going, serving. In Timothy, we see not how God works, not that God works, but how God works. Right? So in Timothy, we're taught some practical ways of how to live by working and serving others. Now, Timothy is a pastoral epistle. Now, most epistles or letters were written to churches. Some of them were written to individuals. Timothy, Titus, Philemon. These were called personal epistles. But Timothy, epistle to Timothy and epistle to Titus are also called pastoral epistles because they were written to people who pastored the church. Though in a very strict sense, they were not pastors as we know them. A pastor stays in the church. Both Timothy and Titus were what we would call apostolic representatives. They were helping plant churches. And then when everything was established, they ordained leaders, local leaders, and they moved on. In that sense, they're different from what we think are pastors. All right, our pastors are taking care of the church, not so much going out and planting churches. They were more the moving on type. Right, the word apostle means sent out. Right. Now, of course, this book is more practical, as I said, how to live out our faith, especially as leaders. Okay, so Timothy was taught how to be a good leader. So it's more practical than doctrinal, and as such, it's probably a bit easier to understand. Most of the epistles, you see the doctrine comes first part, and then out of the doctrine flows certain practices. But here, it's almost all practical. Now, Paul was very old at this time when he wrote to Timothy. Right? These are the last few epistles. He's about to be executed. Timothy was his son in the faith. As far as we know, Paul never got married and had a family. And so Timothy was probably the closest thing he had to family, biological family, someone that he could call his son. And so he calls Timothy my son. And he's probably his protege, you can call it that way, the one he looked forward to replace him when he was gone. That's why 2 Timothy is almost like the letter to 2 Timothy is almost like Paul was passing on his ministry to Timothy, his successor. Now, he had discipled him, he had mentored him. He had first met his mother and grandmother in Lystra, Lystra, which is in Turkey, present-day Turkey. And he liked him. He started to mentor him. And actually, Timothy is just part of a team of co-workers that Paul had, right? Later, like Silas and Titus, etc., Aquila, Priscilla. Now, Timothy had been used by Paul to be his rep. Whenever Paul moved on and there were some problems, he would send Timothy to sort things out. So Timothy had been his rep, his representative in Thessalonica, in Corinth, in Philippi, and now this letter, Timothy is in Ephesus, okay, in Ephesus. And he had been left behind there as Paul moved on. Paul said he had a lot of problems here, just fix it. Now, Timothy also is a co-writer of many of the epistles, at least 6 of them. We know the 2 epistles to the Thessalonians, he was co-writer, 2 to Corinth, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, to Philippians, and to Philemon. So he helped to, Paul says he helped to write the letters. Okay, so co-writer. Now, let's go in straight into First Timothy, and since it's a very short book, we can almost do a little bit of like verse studies in the choice verses. All right, let's turn to First Timothy chapter 1, verse 2. To Timothy, my true child in the faith. All right, so this is like very special to him. In verse 3, as I urged you when I was going to Macedonia, remain at Ephesus so that you may charge certain persons not to teach any different doctrine. Now, there were people still in the church, as Paul had to move on. There were people in the church who were teaching false doctrines. Okay, actually, Paul had already warned. If you can have time, turn to Acts chapter 20 and verses 29 to 30. Paul had told them there will be wolves in your church. All right. Who will teach terrible doctrines that will mess up your church, and they will come from your own people. Now, that's a generic warning, actually. Oftentimes, within the church, there are men who Satan raises up to cause problems in the church by preaching false doctrines, sowing doubts and all kinds of false doctrines. Okay? Now, typically, a church goes stronger when it is persecuted from outside, like the Philippian church, the Thessalonian church. But the Ephesian church grew weaker because it was wrecked from inside. Okay, so generally speaking, it is the Satan attacks inside. If Satan causes outsiders to persecute, he's defeating himself, because persecuted churches get purer and stronger. All right. So, what was their problem? In verse 3, verse 4, not to devote themselves, this is teaching doctrines, to devote themselves to myths and endless genealogies. Wow. Which promotes speculations rather than the stewardship from God that is by faith. So they went in and promoted all kinds of strange myths and endless genealogies. So they probably used the Old Testament and made all kinds of mysterious teachings about the genealogies, which you can speculate, like, is this, who's related to who, and who is got a godly line, and blah, blah, blah. All right, all these things. And so what happens is, it causes speculation in the church. Now, I realize that one of the favorite hobbies of Christians is to speculate on difficult to understand verses. I always have people asking questions about verses that are difficult to understand and frankly of very little practical value. All right. Now, why do people do that? Sometimes they're just plain curious. They want to figure out things that are very hard to figure out. Some people just love to challenge their mind. But I think when you spend time speculating, debating, you don't need to leave the classroom and go out and serve. Now, I find that is quite a common motivation, because going out is very much more difficult than sitting in. Using your mouth is very much easier than your feet and your hands. And so 90% of Christians rather sit in class and ask questions, looking very, very studious, rather than go out and just do sacrificial service. Now, Paul goes on to say that the aim of our charge, verse 5, is love that issues from a pure heart. Right? So the aim of all that we teach is love. Okay, agape love. Looking for needs and meeting needs. Okay, that kind of. Now that is very, very, that's a goal, but it's very rare because speculation takes over. Verse 7, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Most people would rather be teachers of the Word of God rather than servants of God. I've noticed that. Okay, the Greek thinking is teachers are better than servants. And so the church is full of teachers and scholars and students and very few servants and workers, right? Laborers, very, very rare. Okay, that's the goal, to produce people like Christ. Christ was never much a classroom guy. In fact, he never entered a classroom. Went to the synagogue, said something, and then moved on and basically served people. So chapter 1, verse 8 to 11, all right? Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, for the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality, enslavers, liars, perjurers, whatever is contrary to sound doctrine, in accordance with the gospel of the glory of the blessed God with which I have been entrusted. What's Paul saying all this for? Paul is saying that the law is basically to tell us, all right, to tell sinners, these horrible people, that they're sinners. Now, why is that necessary? Because many times the Judaizers, the people who love the law, the Torah, were still in the church, and they kept saying, you must learn the law. You must learn the law. When you obey the law, then you get saved. And Paul said, no. The law is basically to tell these sinners, you are sinners, so that they will turn to Christ. All right? So many times the Jews thought the law was the way to salvation. Okay, but Paul's telling them, no, the law is to slap all these wicked people and say, God doesn't like all this, right? And you still continue in your sin. And they say, I can't help it. I'm like that. I still get involved in sexual sin. I still lie. And God said, yeah, I know. That's why I'm telling you. You can't get saved by the law. You need to turn to Christ. So the purpose of the law was to tell people how sinful they are and how hopeless they are to try to obey the law because they can't. So they will turn to Christ, right? To the gospel. Look at the verse 11, okay? The beautiful gospel of the blessed God, which I've been entrusted. Okay, so I think that even today, many people think that there's some condition for salvation. Though we are not Jews and we don't, but still the idea you need to earn your salvation is still ingrained in the DNA of almost every human being on earth, because it is part of our upbringing, it's part of our religion, right? Of all religion. Now, verse 19, just a little side thing here. Holding faith and a good conscience, by rejecting this, some have made shipwreck of their faith, among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander. Now, I want you to note that Paul names people, all right? And he does so quite often. He names people who should be identified. Now, there's a lot of Christianity today that you mustn't name people. It's not right, okay? Who are you to judge? Now, never judge motives. You can't, right? Motives, only God can see the heart. But you can judge actions. And people who do wrong actions, you can name them. You should. Otherwise, how I know who to avoid? All right? So Christianity has become so mushy today that if you stand up and identify somebody and say that man is doing wrong, shouldn't do that. You shouldn't condemn anyone, Oh yeah, you don't say he's doing wrong because of this. The because is not right. I cannot see why he's doing it, but can see what he is doing it. And if you can't see what he's doing, you need your eyes checked, all right? And if you don't identify it, then what's the point, all right? You have to identify because you want people to avoid, okay? Chapter 2, let's move on quickly. Chapter 2, verse 1 to 4. First of all, then, I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, thanksgiving be made for all people. There's different parts of a prayer, all right? To supplicate, all right? It's to ask, all right? Prayer could be a worship, an adoration. Intercession, you pray for others, all right? and thanksgiving be made for all people, for kings and for all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. This is good and it's pleasing in the sight of God our Savior, who desires all people to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth. So he tells us we should pray for all, especially for our rulers, right? Because when we pray for our rulers, then they will be wise and they will rule in such a way that there will be peace in the land. And when there is peace and order, then we can do our work of reaching out. If there is disorder in any place, then we have no energy to reach out. We just have to defend ourselves from all the chaos and problems around us, right? So pray for good leaders, our leaders, to make good decisions so that we have peace and we can then do positive work like preaching the gospel, not defensive work. So do pray. I don't notice many people never pray for their leaders. They complain more than they pray. Chapter 2, verse 9 to 13, there are a lot of women here in this church who seem to be giving problems in the Ephesian church. Chapter 2, verse 9, likewise also that women should adorn themselves in respectable apparel with modesty and self-control, not with braided hair and gold or pearls or costly attire, but with what is proper for women who profess godliness with good works. Let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or to exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman was deceived and became a transgressor. All right? Now, this passage is a passage that has been, I would say, interpreted in different ways. Okay, it's not an easy passage to come to very clear lines, all right? And I don't pretend to be any clearer than anyone else, okay? It tells us here that there were women in this church who made church a kind of a fashion parade. They spent all their energy dressing up and looking gorgeous. And Paul said, I believe that you should spend more of your time not trying to look good, but do good, right? Focus on doing good, not looking pretty and good, right? So that's basically what Paul was saying. And it appears that these showy women also wanted to take authority in the church. So Paul says, no, you can't take authority over the men, right? Now, in Greek culture, it was democratic, right? Democracy gives people kind of more freedom generally, especially if you're a Roman citizen. You have a lot of freedom. You sort of lorded over your slaves in your household. And it was common for women to have, rich women to have many, many slaves. And so they became kind of bossy, and they went to church and started to boss people around. That's probably the cultural background, right? And so we have some difficult parts here. It says here, all right, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man, but she's to remain quiet. What does that exactly mean? You mean a woman cannot talk in church? Just to be quiet in church? That's what some people teach, right? So that's one extreme. Women cannot say anything, cannot teach, cannot lead, cannot do anything. There's another extreme that says this is cultural. This passage is cultural. It's a particular case in a particular situation, and it's not to be applied at all. Women can do anything they like in the church. So there are two extremes, right? Now, when I don't know how to interpret something exactly, I tend to take a moderate view. And for me, it's like, yeah, women can teach and talk in the church and not to be just totally dumb. They're allowed to talk, they're allowed to ask questions, they're allowed to teach, but not over men. That's what I would believe. In other words, they don't stand on the pulpit, right, and tell men what to do. Okay, right? They can teach children, they can ask questions, they can lead ministries, okay? But always women are women and men are men. In the Bible, we are all equal before God, but the gender divisions are never removed. Man is still a man, a woman is still a woman. A young man is still a young man, old man is still old man. What am I saying? All men should be respected. All right? That never changes. When we become Christians, we always respect age. We also recognize gender. It's made by God. So in the house, all right, there is a male and there are female, men dressed like a man and behave manly, woman dressed like a woman and behave womanly. I just believe that God's creation is to be preserved, not destroyed. Okay, so how do I interpret this? I interpret it in the middle and I say, yes, women can lead, can teach, but be careful not to be manly and to go around bossing men, because that's not how God works. You can talk to men, you can lead men, but in a ladylike way. As for the pastor, my view, right, is that a pastor has to take authority. A pastor is basically the head of the house of God, or the household of God. And when a pastor is a lady, and it's very hard for the church people to see, because when they go home, they see a mother figure, a mother leader, all right? And then at home, the women tend to be bossy, all right? And that's a struggle. That is a struggle in today, as I have taught earlier, because we are told in Ephesians, though, the wife's job is to submit to the husband. So you see the woman leading in the church. And at home, the same pastor has to go home and submit to a husband who was sitting in the congregation there. Now that is difficult. I think that gives a very, very difficult picture in the mind. And teaching is more what you see than what you hear, right? More example than teaching than words. So I stand in the middle on this passage, okay? Now, chapter 3, about elders, okay? The appointment. See, Timothy now had a problem. He had bad elders in Ephesus and who were teaching false doctrines. So he had to remove the bad ones and appoint new ones. And Paul gives the terms in this letter. Hey, Timothy, look for such men to be the elders of the church, right? The elder here, okay, simply means people who are more mature in the faith, not older in age, okay? So you can be older, longer Christian and yet never grow up. You can be still a baby, okay? So we see here there were elders. So it's a plurality, right? Not one elder, several elders, okay? And if you look at very carefully, okay, let's look at verse 2. Therefore, an overseer, an elder the word is oversee, supervise, okay? Over, epi, it's a Greek word, see, scope. That is from the word scope, episkopos. The word overseer is just a translation of the Greek word episkopos, right? Where you get the word episcopal, Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. If someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into the snare of the devil. Right? So if you look here at what the conditions for an elder are, you will realize that the main conditions are about character. not ability. In fact, you only see one ability noted in this entire set of conditions, and that is the ability to teach. So an elder should basically be a man of Christ-like character, good character. All these virtues are not just Christ-like, these are good virtues. Every culture says these are good virtues to have. And he must have good character and be able to teach. And it emphasizes the fact he must rule his house well. Because otherwise, how can he rule the house of God? So I want you to note that God parallels the church as a family, right? And if a man cannot be a good father over his family, how is he going to be a good leader over God's family? Okay, so the church should be a family, and the pastor should have a fatherly, the elders should have a fatherly role. Okay, now, of course, in those days, churches met in houses. So the likely thing is, if you had unruly children and your whole congregation, came to your house and saw the way your kids rule, you're really in trouble. Your example. You see, today you can be an elder looking very religious in church, and your house could be a total mess, and the chances are not a lot of people would see it maybe once a week for an hour or so, okay? But in those days, there was nowhere to go except your house. Your house was like the gathering place, okay? So, in other words, your character really had to show through. Today, if you can speak well and even your home is a mess, it's not such a big issue, okay? Then we see here, the next set of conditions in chapter 3, verse 8 to 13 is for deacons, and it's fairly similar, except they are not needed to be able to teach, okay? So, character-wise, similar. Now, I want you to know they should be a husband of one wife. I think that means they should be males, okay? It's very hard to have a husband of one wife who is a female. So people say, can we have female elders and female deacons? I say, I don't think that's what the Bible told us, right? So now, here we have, again, the deacons must also rule their households well. Now, what's the difference between elder and a deacon? An elder is to watch over, right? Oversee the spiritual state of the church. Deacons, as we learn in the book of Acts, were more to manage the church affairs, right? The finances, how the money, which widow we should support, be sure that, things are properly arranged and so on. So there's a difference, right? It's not like two levels, one more spiritual than the other. No, just different focus, okay? So it's not like if you're a deacon for 4 years, then you become an elder. No, it's not like, it's not in the same classification, One is in charge of temporal things. They're very good at this, good in administration, etc. It's not less than the spiritual part. Always remember, right? Don't think Greek, right? If God puts you to just wipe the table of the church and you do it well, you will have a better reward than a pastor who is asked to preach and didn't do it well, all right? Or did it for his own glory. So we have here the conditions for deacons and elders. Let's go on to chapter 4, verse 3. Then it tells us about the errors of the church. This is one of the errors. Who forbid marriage. These people forbid marriage and require abstinence from foods that God created to be received with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving, for it's made holy by the word of God and prayer. So these were people who came and said, these elders, these were the bad elders who taught a false doctrine. You cannot get married. It's not good to get married. Right? This is very Greek. Greek always separated the physical from the spiritual. They say you should just focus on spiritual things. Getting married is about, the physical side, your physical desires, your needs, your sexual relationships. All those are not good for spiritual. See, that's the Greek thinking. So there are some major Christian groups, Christian inverted commas groups, that say their leaders cannot get married. Okay, it came from this Greek thinking. Okay, now marriage is invented by God. There's nothing bad about it. Sex is invented by God. There's nothing bad about it. When you abuse it, yes, it's bad. Okay, anything you abuse, including food, is bad. Okay, but it's given by God and to be used with thanksgiving, right? So this is a false teaching that made some people be more spiritual because they were not married. Some more spiritual because they didn't eat certain foods. Now I tell you what's spiritual. Becoming molded to be like Christ. That's spiritual. That's the goal. Right? That's the goal. The goal is not in church, right? How people view you in church as spiritual. This word spiritual is totally perverted by our Greek thinking. We say, oh, the guy is very spiritual. Let me see. All he does is read the Bible and argue about speculations in the Bible. This is not spiritual, right? Okay, it's sinful, right? That your word is stuck in your brain and doesn't come out in your life, in blessing, in agape love to others. Okay, you're not being Christ-like. You sit in the classroom all day. You stay in the four walls of your church all day and never go out, Your joy is to run away from your work, and go into church so you can get involved in church activities. That's why Thessalonians is very important. The book of Thessalonians tells us, wherever we are, we work well. Don't be idle, work well. All right. Today's discipleship is all about how we spend our time outside of our workplace. Almost all our teaching is how to have quiet time, how to pray, how to go to church, how to have fellowship in church. But very little teaching is about how you are a good Christian in your workplace, which is where you spend most of your working time. That's why church never impacts the world, right? Because we are spiritual, right? Work is secular. No. Whatever you do, do for the glory of God. Be the best doctor, be the best taxi driver, be the best cleaner, whatever. Shine for God as a Christian wherever you are. Okay? God works in everything, every part of our lives. So we have this kind of strange Christianity, but it's not strange, it's normal now. Chapter 4 verse 8, another Greek issue. For while bodily training is of some value, godliness is of value in every way, as it holds promise for the present life and for the life to come. You say, what were you talking about? The Greeks valued the sports a lot. Olympics came from the Greeks. You always see statues, Greek statues, all muscular men naked, showing their beautiful muscles. The Greeks, Spartans, and all these, right? So for them, okay, there was a clear line between the spiritual or the mental and the physical, and some of them mastered the physical part, and they did a lot of bodily exercise, okay, and they made it almost like a religion. You see their gods look also muscular, and that has come actually into our culture, right? A lot of energy spent on looking good, on exercise. Most of us are victims of this, right? Thinking exercise is highly profitable. Now, it doesn't say it's wrong, okay? It says in verse 8, is of some value. It's good to have some exercise to keep fit, but don't make an obsession of it, okay? Then 4:16 is, look at 4:16, it tells Paul about what his real teaching is. Keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. right? Persist in this, for by so doing you will save both yourself and your hearers. Most preachers I meet are spending hours a day, a week preparing their messages. Some young pastors I talk to say I spend 80% of my working week preparing for my 30-minute message at the end of the week. Okay? They spend a lot of time on the message. What does Paul tell Timothy? Okay? Verse 16, keep a close watch on yourself first and on the teaching. Isn't that important? I tell young preachers, I said, your message mostly will be forgotten. Your life mostly will be seen and remembered. Parents the same. You can nag your children to death with teaching, but what they will be when they grow up is what they see in you, not what they heard. Keep watch on your life and on your teaching. Put it in the right order and perspective. So all these are very practical, right? It's for Paul, the leader. It's for you, father, the leader. It's for you, mother, the leader, right? A lot of these things can be applied in our life. We don't have to be pastors for this. When they say this is a pastoral episode, it's kind of thinking, when I read First Timothy, it's for my pastor. No. All right? In a sense, the word pastoral episode is not a very good term. All right? This is a practical episode for all of us. All of us are to lead some way or other, influence. The word lead is to influence, right? To influence the world with our lives. All right, chapter 5 is basically about widows. It seems to be about widows. Let's look at verse 3. Honor widows who are truly widows, but a widow has children or grandchildren. And then you can read on to verse 16. It tells us how to identify the real widows so that they can avail of help from the church. A lot of verses on this. Now, is this all about widows? Yes, it's all about widows, but can it be applied to other things? Yes. Basically, I think these verses tell us a church not only dispenses good teaching, which is critical, through the example of the leaders and their teaching, but also a church must be practical in helping those in need, in this case, widows. And not just practical. If you read from verse 3 to verse 16, it tells us to be careful to identify the real ones in need from the ones who take advantage of the church's charity. And I see that all the time, right? A church usually swings from one extreme to the other. Many churches don't dispense anything to do with charity. They don't even have a mercy ministry. Normally the deacons are there to help in the mercy ministry, see the needs, temporal needs of members of the church. They lost a job, they lost their child, they need some help in the process, their mother stroke, so on, right? Those are temporal needs. The deacons should be. But most deacons know today they are very also sort of less spiritual, but also basically in the spiritual work in the church. Okay, so it's just kind of like a perversion already. Now, churches should be doing charity. Most churches don't do it at all, and then other churches just give charity very indiscriminately. They start all kinds of mercy ministries, right? And the world takes advantage of it simply because, right, they're not very discerning. Most of these Christian charities just give out to everybody. Suddenly they feel merciful, and they give to people who don't need it, and the world laughs again at it. So one hand, the world says, Christians just talk. All they do is they're in their church. They don't impact society. And the other, when they impact society, they are quite gullible. All right. So chapter 5, verse 3 to 16 tells us, do charity, but be discerning. Okay, now verse 17 to 18. Let the elders who rule well be considered worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in preaching and teaching. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages. Now, you don't muzzle an ox. So that's in the Old Testament. When an ox is pulling that millstone, pulling this heavy millstone to grind the grain, the ox should be not muzzled so he can eat hay at the same time and keep his energy going. In other words, you should feed the ox who does the work. In the same principle, take care financially of your leaders. You should take care of them, all right? So that is also a principle. You not only care for the poor widow, you also take care of those who feed you spiritually. Let's go on to chapter 6. Okay. Verse 1 and 2. Let all those who are under a yoke as bondservants regard their own masters as worthy of all honor, so that the name of God and the teaching may not be reviled. Those who have believing masters must not be disrespectful on the ground that they are brothers. Rather, they must serve all the better, since those who benefit by their good service are believers and beloved. So this is about slavery. Now, the Bible never tells slaves to rebel. Slavery was very much a part of all history, human history. It's a very sad part of it, okay? But was part of it. And in the Roman household, slaves were dominant in the sense that they often outnumbered the household, all right? So Paul never said, all right, we're all equal, we're free, rebel. No. Paul reformed slavery. He said to the slaves, you're serving your masters, do a good job, because you're just glorifying God by serving them. Just like you work, wherever work you do it well, because you do it for God. Let the world see how good we are as Christians, right? But then he tells the Christian masters, right, to treat them, okay? Later on, he tells the Christian masters to treat them well. So what Paul did actually was, he did not cause a rebellion, he caused a reform. So that soon enough, the Christians who had slaves treated their slaves well, and the slaves behaved well, and slowly slavery lost its impact in the Christian world, right? Not by rebellion, but by changing it from a new heart of serving their master and the master's new heart of taking care of their slavery, and soon they freed their slaves. Okay, so the best way of reform is not rebellion, it's a new heart. And then it goes on to chapter 6 verse 6. Chapter 6 verse 6. But godliness with contentment is great gain, for we brought nothing into the world, we can take nothing out of this world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. All right, Paul tells us that the best way to be rich is to be content. Godliness with contentment is great gain. We all want great gain in our life. We want to be advanced, right? Get more. How to get more? By getting more? No. By learning this very wonderful thing called contentment. When you're content, food tastes good. The food you eat. The clothes you wear feel good. Right? The wife you have looks more beautiful. Right? The kids you have bring you greater joy. When you are content, right, you have satisfaction. When you are greedy, even if you have something, you can never be satisfied because you want something else, right? If I have 5,000 pairs of shoes and I'm a greedy man, I don't enjoy the 5,000 pairs I have. I want the 5,001 pair that I don't have, the additional one I don't have. So contentment is great gain, right? And Paul's preparing the ground for the next episode where he tells us, you know what happens? The greedy people are often inside the church, the leaders, right? And we will see that all around, okay? Because as I said, religion is one of the easiest ways to make money, right? You can play on people's fears, right? And you don't need a lot of capital, you just need no conscience to be a religious crook, okay? So he tells us here, be content. That's the way to go. Having food and your basic needs, be content, right? Of course, the word basic needs becomes stranger and stranger now. People have many needs now. And then finally we end with chapter 6, verse 17 and 19. As for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, not to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. So he tells those in the church, Timothy, tell those in the church who have money, right, to be rich in good works. Give out your money. Every dollar you give out for Christ gets invested in the bank of heaven. Not necessarily you get it back here. You get the satisfaction here. You get the rewards in heaven, right? The eternal reward. So be rich in good works. So how do you measure richness as a Christian? It's not how much you have, it's how much you gave, right? And that's true riches because you're storing it up in the bank of heaven. All right, so what have we seen in First Timothy? We've seen a lot of practical lessons, okay? And what does it tell us? God is not a God who tells us to shave our head, go into a cave and hide from the world. God is a God who's very practical. God impacts every part of our life. God cares for everything in our life, right? God doesn't just care for our spiritual state. God impacts every part, as he shows in Timothy. Every part of our life should be touched, right? To do good, to be a blessing, right? And Jesus, the perfect example of God, he went about, touching lives, leading a very practical, we would not even call it the spiritual life by today's standards. Jesus would not pass the spiritual test by today's perverted idea of spirituality, right? And many Christians want to be spiritual, be Christ-like, right? Be practical. Jesus exampled it, and you follow it, right? And so we see all these things about how to lead your house, how to manage your money, how to do charity, all these things, okay? Not so much about sitting in the classroom for hours upon hours and be so impractical. There are so many Christians today who are so spiritually minded and so practically useless, right? And that includes lots of pastors who are so practically useless. Timothy was asked to be practically useful and impact lives. Okay, so I believe this shows you what an amazing God we have, who touches every aspect of our life that we even call secular. He just impacts it, and life is so beautiful because of this God. Not being spiritual, don't hide in a cave, right? But enjoy life to its fullest. I don't mean immoral things, but in all the blessings that God has given us, our family, our world, our work, and everything else. And you follow this formula, you will have a full life. May God bless you.